Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an AO7 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com.
Way back in March of 2002, I turned 21 and was curious to branch out from the basic yellow lagers I was accustomed to drinking at college parties. I lived in Bellingham, Washington, where at the time there was but a single option for fresh craft beer, Boundary Bay Brewery. While I was familiar with styles like IPA and ESB, I was a bit overwhelmed with all of the options they offered, but ultimately settled on something that sounded more like a liquor than a beer. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the wonderful style that used to be called Scotch Ale, though is now more commonly referred to as Wee Heavy, is contributor Martin Keene.
I have grown to love the style of Wee Heavy. It took a while, but that bready, toasty, malty character and the caramel and the toffee, I really quite enjoy it. And it's also the highest ABV of all the Scottish beers. So you need to be careful with Wee Heavy because it goes as high as up to 6% ABV, 6%, Marshall.
It can get higher than that. Now, I've spent so much time in various pubs drinking so many different beers that it's impossible for me to remember all of them, but I will never forget that first experience at Boundary Bay, taking my initial sip of that Scotch Ale and being absolutely blown away with just how flavorful it was, a far cry from the beers I'd previously consumed. While you may not hear us talk too much about Scottish ales, I do remain a huge fan, and I was, unlike you, Martin, I was a fan from the beginning. The first sip I took, I was like, man, these are so different. And I look forward to chatting with you about Wee Heavy, as well as my attempt to brew one short and shoddy style. Little disclaimer, you could probably tell I'm getting over something. I even tested for COVID. It's not COVID, but here we are, and I sound like a weirdo, so please bear with me. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up next month, September of 2024, I suppose that would be this month, is Brewlosophy contributor and the Brew Club leadership member Will Lovell is going to be taking the stage yet again to answer more patron questions. It's been over a year since the last time he did this, so we figured it was time to bring him back. And Will really does hope that people feel comfortable asking him about more than just beer. He's into barbecue. He does some bread making. He's a hunter. So get those questions ready. Ask him whatever you like. To be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Saturday, September 21st, 2024, as Will's going to be taking questions on Sunday, the 22nd. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook and Patreon pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to help us out is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for that referral. And then if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who in addition to having a remarkable YouTube channel chock full of great brewing related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best electric brewing systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120 volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240 volt 10-gallon system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Listener Kyle LeBlanc wrote in with some feedback after listening to episode 341, where we talked about the impact extended contact time with Trube has on a Kolsch. Kyle said, I found it surprising that no difference was tasted in that experiment. I can only imagine Trub doesn't taste very good, and having beer sitting on it would only seem logical that it would impart some sort of flavor. However, maybe both of the beers had been imparted with the flavor. The contact area between the two beers would be the same, only the surface area of the contact between the beer and the Trub would be the same in both kegs. It would be interesting to see if the results would be different if a large amount of Trub were placed in a keg on its side, which would guarantee a significant difference in the contact area. If you had one large 1 ounce chunk of wood aging in a porter, it would likely not give the same effect as 1 ounce worth of shavings, right? What do you think about that, Martin? The whole contact area of the Trub with the beer being more the factor there contributing to the differences, as opposed to, I understand what Kyle's saying here is that you could have like a whole foot of Trub, but the only part that's actually contacting the beer is the surface of that Trub. So
yeah, that makes perfect sense. That would be something interesting to test because, yeah, it's the same when I've been putting in sort of oak aging beers and so forth. You want to increase the amount of contact area. So it would be interesting to test. I mean, that said, I've left beer sat on Trub for a stupidly long time, mainly because I've forgotten about it. And this isn't a side-by-side blinded test or anything like that. But to me, those beers came out just fine. So yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't make a difference anyway. But that would be an interesting thing to try.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Anyone who's ever tasted the flavor of, I don't even know if it's true, but the flavor that I got in my Trub experiment that did come back significant, and it was the one where I poured everything from the kettle into the fermenter, and then I let them age for a while. I described the flavor as like flubber or something like that, and it's really this like burnt rubbery. It's awful. If you've tasted it, it's kind of unmistakable to not pick it up again. I tasted Ryan's beers in the experiment that Kyle's referencing, and they didn't have that flavor in them. So both were great. Maybe if the surface area was different, there would have been more disparity in the characteristics of those beers. But I don't know. I'm not convinced if it's the Trub as much as it is all of the other stuff that's in the kettle at the end, of the boil. That's going to take a lot more parsing out, of course, through experimentation. But I think, Kyle, you make a really good point, and easy enough experiment for us to add to the list. So that's exactly what we've done. Thank you so much for reaching out with your feedback. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. All right. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@thebrulosophy show, where Martin is pumping out awesome brewing and beer related content. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, chances are you're going to love the Brulosophy show as well, perhaps even more than this show. All right. When we're back from this break, our focus will be on Wee Heavy.
Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exhilarator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brulosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exhilarator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exhilarator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exhilarator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
After investing billions to light up our network, T-Mobile is America's largest 5G network. Plus, right now, you can switch, keep your phone, and we'll pay it off up to $800. See how you can save on every plan versus Verizon and AT&T at T-Mobile.com/across America.
Up to 4 lines via virtual prepaid card. Allow 15 days. Qualifying unlocked device credit service ported 90-plus days with device and eligible carrier and timely redemption required. Card has no cash access and expires in 6 months.
Imagine relying on a dozen different software programs to run your business, none of which are connected, and each one more expensive and more complicated than the last. It can be pretty stressful. Now, imagine Odoo. Odoo has all the programs you'll ever need, and they're all connected on one platform. Doesn't Odoo sound amazing? Let Odoo harmonize your business with simple, efficient software that can handle everything for a fraction of the price. Sign up today at odoo.com. That's ODOO.com.
A few years ago, I was lucky enough to be invited to speak at the annual Homebrewers Conference in Dublin, Ireland, which is put on by the National Homebrew Club. I brought my wife with me, and the day after the conference ended, we hopped over to Edinburgh, Scotland for a couple days before returning to Dublin for a week-long road trip. In addition to all the Scotch whiskey, which I absolutely love, that I drank while I was there, I also had the opportunity to drink a lot of Scottish beer styles, like traditional classic Scottish beer styles, which, included Wee Heavy. And it was so good. I mean, there's nothing quite like drinking a traditional regional beer in the region where it was invented. But Wee Heavy, it's just like I said earlier in my story, it's got this special place in my heart. It was one of the very first craft beers that I ever sampled. I still love it. So to be able to go to Scotland and try it, it was just a magical moment. So in talking about Wee Heavy, I've mentioned that it is a traditional style. Why don't we start off with a little bit of history, Martin?
Yeah, let's do that. So this was purportedly developed in the 18th century. And if you think about the availability of ingredients in Scotland, well, barley is abundant. It's everywhere. But hops, not too easy to grow too many styles of hops in the cold kind of wet climate of Scotland. So that sort of generally led to Scottish beers being maltier beer styles, right? They generally are maltier. And specifically, this is really kind of the maltiest, strongest of all of the beer styles, Wee Heavy. So Wee Heavy, wee, that's Scottish for small, basically. And we referring specifically to the small serving size because of its, we're going to put this in air quotes, the high alcohol content. And then heavy, that describes the strength of the beer, so how strong it is. Now, actually, this is kind of interesting how the Scots do this. So back in the day, the Scots would price their beer based on strength. So the more that it cost, the stronger it was. So it all became part of something called the shilling system. And that was all based on the price of a large barrel of beer, which is called a hogshead. So the price in shillings, 60 shillings, would get you a light beer, which would be considered sort of in the low 3% ABV area. If you went to 70 shilling, you'd get a stronger beer because we use more malt in that, so maybe up to 4%. Then export was also known as 80 shillings, so that was between 4 and 5. And then Wee Heavy, that's the expensive one. That was the 90 shilling one, and that's talking about an ABV of maybe 6 or even higher. So by today's craft beer standards, that's not very high at all. But back then, that was considered the high alcohol beer, and that's why it's served in much smaller glasses. I kind of think of like getting a really strong Belgian beer now. They don't pour that into a pint glass. But I suppose back in the 18th century, that was the equivalent then of these fairly high alcohol beers.
Yeah, well, and just to note, you can go to a brewery today and get a Wee Heavy that's upwards of 10% alcohol. As things do, the style evolved a bit. People put their spin on it, and I believe the ones that I was drinking, even over in Scotland, were around 8% alcohol. So, but yes, traditionally, Wee Heavy was the more potent version of a Scottish ale, which they kind of followed in the same, correct me if I'm wrong, Martin, but it kind of followed in the same vein as English breweries, where they basically were making the same, kind of, again, air quotes, the same beer, just different strengths. So, you could get a heavy, a Wee Heavy, kind of like a bitter, ordinary bitter, strong bitter, similar style, similar flavor profile, just different strengths. And I think that's pretty cool. Wee Heavy of all of them is my favorite of all the Scottish ales, so we're going to stick with that. The BJCP provides the following description of Wee Heavy. They say it's a rich, sweet malt depth with caramel, toffee, and fruity flavors, full-bodied and chewy with warming alcohol, restrained bitterness, but not cloying or syrupy. One of the unique qualities about Wee Heavy to me is that because of the absence of hops, it's not only not hoppy, it's not very bitter either. It really is. This is one of those beers that leans into the sweetness aspect of it. And I think that's probably part of the reason that I found it so appealing when I first started, when I tried my first craft beer, back in 2002 or whatever it was, is that it wasn't bitter. A lot of people have this view of beer is already being bitter. This is kind of a good one to try out in the beginning because it is more sweet, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, it's what makes it really stand out from the other Scottish ale categories. When I was working my way through the BJCP guidelines and brewing them all, when I got to the Scottish styles, the light, heavy, and the export were the same exact recipe. I would just add a little bit more malt into each one.
Yeah.
But it's the same beer. It's literally just the ABV is the only thing that's different. Where Wee Heavy is different is it's not only a bit stronger in ABV, but it does also incorporate more of these caramel toffee notes into the beer. It's a much thicker, maltier beer. So it really does stand apart, I think, from those other beer styles.
Yeah, without a doubt. So let's break down some of the kind of typical characteristics. In terms of appearance, you're looking for light copper to dark brown in color, often with deep ruby highlights. Very clear. This beer is not meant to be hazy. The foam is going to be large. A kind of a large, fluffy tan head that may or may not persist. That's not necessarily a paid attention to thing. And then they note that it can have legs. That's just, if you kind of swirl it and let the beer fall back down to the bottom of the glass, if there's kind of a dripping, I don't even know how to describe what legs are other than calling them legs, but because of the higher alcohol content, you may get legs on the glass as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's that thicker, more viscous beer, it does tend to sort of slowly work its way back down the glass. So yeah, I think it's a pretty unmistakable color. Actually, I love the color of Wee Heavy because it is typically it's just so dense. It's definitely not a beer I would bother finding because I just love the look of that sort of that dense sort of. It looks like a piece of toffee in a glass, something like that. So that's the appearance. The aroma. The aroma is a very strong malty aroma, sort of bready, toasty malt. You might get notes of caramel, possibly quite a lot of caramel or toffee or caramelized sugar, something like that. It's going to smell a little bit like dessert, which is quite pleasant, but also toasty, bready as well. So I've heard it described as sort of like an English biscuit, and we're talking about proper biscuits here, not the biscuits you'd put gravy on, but the biscuits you'd have with a cup of tea. So this would go very well with that. Maybe a little bit of roast. I think you have to be quite careful with Wee Heavy because it's not a particularly roasty style, but right. You may get a touch of that. Maybe a little bit of dark fruit esters as well, which comes, I think, a little bit from the high ABV, but not much in the way of floral, orange, citrus, or spicy or anything like that, but maybe a touch.
Yeah, the way I describe, I like that they use biscuits and you call them proper biscuits. The way they note graham cracker, and I think that's a bit closer to what an American might describe that toastiness as. But to me, if you've ever had a Biscoff, those are proper English biscuits, right? The little crackers or cookie type things.
They're closer, yeah.
They're closer. Well, they taste delicious, but to me, that is very characteristic of the flavor of a Wee Heavy, that toastiness in that. And it's going to be the same in the flavor as it is the aroma. I mean, it just kind of matches it very well. Rich, bready, toasty malt, full and sweet on the palate with caramel and toffee. The sweetness of this beer is balanced by the alcohol, more so by the alcohol than it is hop bitterness. And then there, like you said, there can be a little hint of like grainy roast, but it should not be the feature flavor in this beer style. You can get some medium to low alcohol esters, things like hints of plums, raisins, dried fruit, stuff like that. Again, very low bitterness, lending kind of more of a sweet medium to dry finish. And then a medium to low hop flavor is optional. It doesn't even really need to be there because that's not what this style is all about.
Right. And then as for mouthfeel, this is quite a full-bodied mouthfeel. So thick, chewy, viscous, that might not sound great, but creamy, I guess is a better one. But yeah, you do want a pretty thick, full mouthfeel to this. Bit of alcohol warmth as well. Nothing that's too biting, but quite smooth. You might get to sort of balance out some of that malty sweetness. Moderately carbonated. And as for serving temperature, generally cask sort of temperatures, so 50 to 55 Fahrenheit, that's 10 to 13 Celsius, would be ideal for this. You will pick up a lot more of the malt notes if you do Do serve it a little bit warmer than a typical beer. That said, the malt notes are so very strong in this beer, you're going to get them anyway, but I would still prefer to drink this as a cask ale.
Yeah, I agree. This is one of those styles that just really, I feel, benefits from being served like a cask ale, a little bit warmer than we're used to. When I make them, I still serve them cold, but I'll let it sit out for a little bit and it warms up as I'm drinking the full pint. I don't mind our wee, but it really does seem to kind of open up with a little bit of warmth. Now, the vital stats, this is where you're really going to get a look into how strong this beer can be. For OG, it can be anywhere from 1070 to 1130 OG with a finishing gravity of 1018 to 1040 for a final ABV of anywhere between 6.5 and 10%. That is not a weak beer. That is a wee heavy beer, but you're going to have a couple of these and you'll be feeling it.
My goodness, a 1040 finishing gravity. Yeah, this is going to be a pretty full-bodied
I've had beers
beer
that start
with
at 1040.
Exactly. So, when you have such a high ABV, you would typically have a fairly high IBU count. Just kind of balance that out, but that is absolutely not the case. So between 17 and 35 IBU, the BJCP guidelines recommend. So that's not at all hoppy, and in a beer that is as full-bodied as this, it's basically not detectable level of hops at all. So keep that in mind. And then for color, we've talked about the color of this and how it really does look like a caramel toffee kind of color. In terms of SRM numbers, that's somewhere between 14 to 25.
Yeah, when we talk about the IBU, if you just look at it this way, if you go with the minimums of the stats that the BJCP recommends, 1070 to 1018, okay? Let's just say you hit both of those with only 17 IBU. I'm not sure there's another style out there where you'd look and say, oh, that's great. Because most of us want that bitterness to balance the sweetness. This is one of those unique styles where you really want the sweetness to kind of be there, So keep that in mind. In terms of characteristic ingredients that you might use to make a wee heavy today, right off the bat, the malt and grains, get some Scottish pale malt, which we call Golden Promise. The stuff is amazing. It's kind of the Scottish equivalent to Maris Otter, would you say?
Yeah, exactly that. You have to go with Golden Promise if you can at all get it. Maris Otter in a pinch would also work. There's not a tremendous difference. There's also a bunch of other grains here. This is probably not going to be your simplest malt bill when you're building a wee heavy because it is so malt forward, right? But you're going to see sort of crystal and roasted malts to develop that characteristic sweetness. So we might be looking at roasted barley, chocolate malt, maybe even a touch of black malt if used sparingly for a bit of color. What you do not want to include, and the BJCP point this out, is peat smoked malt. You might think, Scottish, this is a strong beer, let's, add that in. No peat smoked malt.
Yeah, peat smoked malt. I know it's a controversial, ingredient. A lot of people hate it. I have a buddy who makes I believe it's a barley wine, and he uses like 0.5% peat smoked malt, and he made it without it once, and all of his friends could tell. But with it, you don't taste the peat. There's like an umami character to it. I've had wee heavy made with peated malt, and it's great if it's done right. But the BJCP says not to do that. It's not a normal ingredient in this. One thing before we move on to the other ingredients that just, put a pin in this, but those grains should be relatively fresh. Okay. You want to, as with every style of beer, you want those grains to be fresh, milled fairly soon, at near the time of brewing. So keep that in mind. In terms of hops, typically, they were using what they could get most easily. So that's going to be your classic English varieties or in modern days, like a domestic or US variant of those English varieties. East Kent Goldings, Fuggle, Willamette. Is there any other ones you can think of, Martin?
Ideally you put some Scottish hops in, but I'm not sure there is such a thing. So
I was wondering,
that's as close as you're going to get. I don't think so.
I mean, I'm sure there's some people growing hops in Scotland. I'm just not familiar with them. So
right. So you go with those kind of classic English hops, but as you mentioned, this is a very low hop presence beer. So any of the aroma and flavor characteristics that you might typically get from EKG or Fuggle are going to be pretty much muted by the malt character of this. We're really just adding them in for bitterness, typically added in as the early edition hops. For yeast, Scottish ale yeast would be the obvious choice here. So the McEwen strain, that's A31 tartan from Imperial. I think that's WLP 028 and Y 1728. You could also go down some of the English ale yeast strains as well. I mean, the important thing here is you want something that has an alcohol tolerance that's quite high. So 10% ABV, something like that. You want it to produce some sort of subtle esters, which is why we're looking at these English yeasts. So you might go with AO1 House, that's the Whitbread strain, or AO9 Pub, that's Fuller's, or Safale SO4 as well.
Yeah, I had a friend who made a wee heavy with Safale SO4, and I'm not typically a fan of that yeast or the characteristics in lighter beers. It was an excellent wee heavy though. So the nice thing about wee heavy is its strength and the just utter maltiness can really cover up, other things that you may not like about other ingredients, because again, the focus is really on that malt. So adjuncts, they say in the BJCP that it's optional, but they don't list any. So I'd imagine like corn or, maybe even rice, but most wee heavy recipes I doubt are using many adjuncts, or maybe molasses or something to really bump up the ABV. This is one of those beer styles. I've said this before about English beers as well. They did not have a complicated brewing process. Pretty simple, but very similar to what a lot of home brewers are doing today. So in terms of water chemistry, I read that Scotland was known for having softer water, so a neutral profile with very light minerality is probably a good starting place, though you can kind of adapt it to whatever you like. I don't think, this is one of those styles, even if you go with a higher sulfate to chloride ratio, that malt is going to round itself out. You're still going to get it. So, utilizing that as a way to kind of increase drinkability is my way of thinking about it, by adding a little bit of sulfate. That's what I do. But I know a lot of people who are going to lean more into the chloride side of it to create that warm kind of, rounded malt flavor.
Right. And then it becomes all about the mash, because this is such a malt forward beer style. So the mash is super important here. Single infusion, you typically just pick a temperature somewhere of around, between 148 through to 154, so 65 to 68 Celsius. Mash for at least an hour, maybe 90 minutes would be preferable, especially considering just the pure amount of grain that's going to be in here as well. And we probably want to favor beta amylase to make it a little bit more fermentable, to encourage dryness as much as we can. That said, we have talked about a final gravity of 1040, which is not particularly dry, but we want to try and get somewhat in that direction. So key to this beer really is to have a very sturdy, long mash to make sure that we are getting as much of those fermentable sugars out as we can.
Exactly. Nothing really surprising there. Again, I think if anybody's ever made a barley wine or another high ABV beer, that's kind of the typical process. You're going to boil this beer. So this is, I think when it gets to the boil, it's kind of interesting. People have different ideas. All the wee heavy that I've made, with the exception of the one that we're going to talk about here in a minute, I would boil for a typical 60-minute, duration. I have friends who, when they make wee heavy specifically, will boil for 2 hours. I know people who have boiled for like 6 hours. The whole goal there being not only, to achieve your isomerization of alpha acids and drive off DMS, but there's this idea that by doing that, you're encouraging some level of caramelization. Now, I've heard that caramelization is not actually what's happening during the boil. It's just condensation. You're condensing that wort, which is great, except you could achieve the same thing just by not using as much water in the beginning. But that's neither here nor there. The typical boil length, I think, is probably 60 to 90 minutes, for a wee heavy.
Right, so we spent 90 minutes getting the mash right, and then we've got another 90 minutes to encourage a bit of caramelization. So we're quite a ways into our brew day at this point. So what's left to do? Well, we need to chill the wort. So as with almost any style, quicker the better to get a good cold break, and then rack as little of the trub to the fermenter as possible. And once it's in the fermenter, well, you're probably not going to need to do an awful lot with temperature control for this. Typically 66 to 68 Fahrenheit, so just a little cooler than typical room temperature. That's 19 to 20 Celsius, and just let it ride from there.
Yeah. Yep. Easy goes it on this one. Again, nice, simple English style, Scottish style ale here. When it's done fermenting, you really want to wait to ensure that this style of beer has bottomed out, right? Even if it's at 1040, because you started with a super high OG, What you don't want is for this to start re-fermenting in the package. So give it, test it a couple of times over a few days. Make sure it's finished fermenting. Then you rack it over to your whatever packaging you're going to do, and let it age for a while. I've got buddies who make Wee Heavy relatively often. They'll let them age for 8 weeks or so, kind of like a lager, because there's this idea that over time, the beer kind of calms down and just develops, and those flavors really seem to come together. You can filter Scottish ales, Wee Heavy. I don't know if the Scots used isinglass like they did in England, but I would imagine they probably stole that idea from them or used it as well. Modern chemical filtration, you could use Biofine, you could use Clarity Firm. I would use gelatin. That would be my go-to. You could also use mechanical filtration if you want to. I don't think there's much concern about that piece of it.
Marshall, I'm beginning to wonder if you're playing a secret drinking game to say isinglass on every podcast that I'm on, because it seems to come up a lot.
I just know how much you like fish bladder. That's
That's right. I'm yet to use fish bladder. Personally, when I'm brewing this style, I'm not bothering with filtration because of the point you made, which is to say you're going to want to let this age. So it's going to kind of lager in cold temperatures for a good while anyway. At that point, most stuff is going to drop out. So sure. Crack out the fish bladders if you feel like it, but I think this is a step we could probably skip. And then in terms of just packaging and carbonation and serving, well, if you're going to put this into a cask, you could actually naturally condition and carbonate the beer that way. If we're going to go just the more regular homebrew way and put this into a keg, I would just force carbonate it to a moderate amount of carbonation, and then crack out the little glasses, the wee glasses, in order to serve it.
It's got to be in the wee glass. No, I serve mine in normal glasses, but I do serve a little bit less, and I let it warm up in the glasses I mentioned before. What to look for in a good example of the style? I think, obviously you want notable malt flavor and sweetness that's balanced more by the alcohol than the hop bitterness, minimal hop aroma and flavor. If you get a little bit of that kind of more earthy hop character, that's perfectly fine. I think you're going to get some earthiness just from the malt character as well that you're using. Some alcohol warmth, but it shouldn't be hot. No fusel alcohols, and relatively clean fermentation. Maybe just a hint of some esters in there as well to add kind of a dark fruit, plumminess to it. If you've ever had Belhaven Wee Heavy or McEwen Scotch Ale, Orkney Skull Splitter's another one. You know what a good Wee Heavy is supposed to taste like. I personally love McEwen Scotch Ale. I think it's delicious.
Yeah, that is a good one. We have a brewery here in North Carolina in Asheville called Highland Brewing, and they do a bunch of Scottish styles, including a Wee Heavy, which is really good as well. I always kind of wondered actually why we had a Scottish brewery in the mountains of North Carolina. It didn't seem very obvious. But interesting fact is that the Appalachian Mountains, which run through Asheville, they're the same mountain range as the mountains in Scotland, and it's just continental drift that's pulled them apart. So there's actually a lot of Scottish heritage in North Carolina, and when you're in the Appalachian Mountains and you look around, it kind of looks a lot like the Scottish Highlands, and that's why.
That is so interesting. See the things we learn on the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm just saying. Well, whether sipping a version made in a friend's garage or sitting at a pub on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, I've always enjoyed Wee Heavy and have brewed a handful of batches myself. A few years ago, I was curious to see how one would turn out if I cut a bunch of corners and brewed one up short and shoddy. Those results when we're back from this break.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Are you ready for your brewing game to upgrade? Well, the Easy Dens and Smart Ref combo by Anton Parr delivers just that. Get precise wort and alcohol content measurements and follow the fermentation of your beer straight on your phone. The Brewmeister app helps you analyze data, compare batches, and perfect your recipes. We're big fans of the Easy Dens and use it to get accurate measurements with very reliable results. Just ask the Brewlosophy Show's Martin Keene. Check out EasyDens.com today and use code BREW15 for 15% off. That's BRU15 to get 15% off your order. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
It's better over here. AT&T customers, switching to T-Mobile has never been easier. We'll pay off your existing phone and give you a new one free, all on America's largest 5G network. Visit T-Mobile.com/carrier freedom to switch today.
Pay off up to $650 via virtual prepaid MasterCard in 15 days. Free phone up to $830 via 24 monthly bill credits plus tax. Qualifying port-in, trade-in service on Go 5G Next and credit required. Contact us before canceling entire account to continue bill credits or credit stop and balance and required finance agreement is due.
Back in the summer of 2015, a local homebrewing friend of mine who goes by the name Shoddy B stopped by my house to participate in a triangle test, and when he did that, he dropped off a little gift. A bag of milled grains that he said he picked up from our local homebrew shop the month prior. He was, I think naturally, he was worried that these grains had gone bad. He didn't have a mill at the time, and so he milled them at the shop. So he figured, you know what, these are a month old. Marshall does some weird stuff. I'm just going to leave these with him, and he can use them for an experiment or whatever. And of course I accepted. So I took this bag of grains. They were in a clear plastic bag, honestly. And I threw them on my shelf in my garage, and they sat there for 2 years. Now, anybody who's familiar with the weather here in Fresno, California, we're lucky enough to not have high humidity. Even when it's, 115 degrees, our humidity will be down at 15 to 20%. It's very nice. But it gets hot as hell. And those grains sat there through 2 summers, as well as 2 winters, which, we get down to a frigid 45 degrees every once in a while. So, that was my plan was I'm going to leave them out here for a long time, and we'll see what we're going to do with them, in a couple of years. Well, in those 2 years, we started the whole short and shoddy thing. It was actually relatively new at the time that I brewed this beer. And so that's what I decided to do with it. This was one of the first, I think, 5 short and shoddy batches once we started the official series. So now Scotty did tell me when he dropped them off that it was for a Scotch ale, which I knew at the time was a wee heavy. So that's what I went with. I mean, I could have done anything. He didn't leave me with anything else. It was just the grains. So I did use my own hops and my own yeast, and all of that was fresh. But the grains, 2 years old. What would you expect from milled grains sitting on your shelf in the 2 hot summers? What would you expect from that?
Marshall, this is absolutely wild. So to put this into perspective, before I got a grain mill at home, I used to get my grains milled at the homebrew store, and I'd go in and I was brewing every week, so I would get a month's worth of ingredients. I'd get four of these bags, and just the same bags that it looks like you had these grains in. I'd get them milled up and I'd bring them home, and I would start to get really worried if I had not got through to the 4th bag within a couple of weeks, because these things are going stale and so forth.
Yep.
Well, it got worse when I got an actual grain mill. So when I got a grain mill, it used to be that the night before brew day, I'd weigh out my grains, I'd run them through the mill, and then I'd just put them in a bucket and then have them ready for the next morning. And I started getting worried that overnight was an awful long time to leave these things milled. So I would actually start heating up my water in the mornings, having not done anything. And just before I'm about to mash, that was the time that I was ready to actually mill these grains so that they went in fresh. And I had this mindset of like coffee. With coffee beans, you want to grind them just before you actually use them to really lock in the freshness. Otherwise, they oxidize and so forth. So I started to think in my mind, that's the same with malt as well. My beers are going to come out much better if I delay the milling process to the very last moment, literally 20 minutes before they're going in. The fact that you have left them 2 years before going in absolutely blows my mind.
I mean, when Shoddy dropped them off, they were already a month old. And like you, I was like, oh, these are already shot. Might as well just save them and figure out something to do with them. I will say, in the 2 years that they were sitting on my shelf, it'd become kind of like a friend to me. So when I finally decided to use these grains, there was a weird bittersweet, experience that I had with that. It's like, oh my God, I'm actually getting back to these things, So now this one was brewed on my old propane setup that I had fashioned into my garage. This was pre-electric brewing. I mean, this was 2017, I believe, that I made this beer, something like that. So it was a full volume, 5-gallon brew in a bag batch. Now, for the pre-brew preparation, obviously the grains were milled a couple of years prior, but the night before brewing, I did collect the full volume of filtered water. I did not adjust it with any minerals. I just want to, Scotland has that nice soft water. I've got really soft water at my house, so I went with that. And then I set a heat stick on a timer to turn on about an hour before I planned to start brewing the next morning. Now, I was very familiar with this approach, so I knew that if I went outside, an hour after the heat stick turned on, I'd be right around where I wanted to be for my strike temperature. So the next morning, and actually what I did, at this point, I'm not sure it matters, but I did move the grains out of the plastic bag into my brew in a bag the night before, and they set out there. I mean, some people worry about that. I was at 2 years already, so I wasn't too worried about it. Now, one of the lucky things that I was able to get from Shoddy is he did give me his grain bill, so I knew what was in the bag. It's a pretty big one here: 44% pale malt, 44% Maris Otter malt, 2.75% biscuit, 2.75% Crystal 120, 2.75% Crystal 75, 2.75% Carapils, and 1% chocolate malt just for that color. I wouldn't say that's atypical for a wee heavy.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier that you're not going to have the simplest of malt bills for this. So yeah, you've really got everything there to give it that sort of that rich caramel toffee flavors. But it's interesting to note, just looking at your recipe here, that with all of these malts that you've added in, including Crystal 75 and chocolate malt, that this was actually on the lighter end of the color spectrum, so around 16 SRM. So really, that's about as light as a wee heavy gets.
Well, that's what I think the recipe would have you believe. We'll talk about the appearance later, but it did end up being darker than I expected. And that, who knows? There's so many things that could contribute to that, but in this case, it was a little bit darker. Now, for the brewing, I woke up the next morning. Again, the heat stick had already preheated that water, so I'm not even counting, the heat up time in my total time. And when I went outside, what I told myself was, whatever the temperature is, I'm just going to mash in and we're going to go with it. Again, this was at the beginning of the short and shoddy thing. And so I did that, and my mash temperature was about 4 degrees higher than I was hoping for, at 154 degrees Fahrenheit or 68 degrees C. But still, a lot of people these days refer to that temperature as kind of the sweet spot for alpha and beta amylase activity. It activates both. They both do their thing. So I was perfectly fine with that. I left the mash for just 30 minutes, not some 90-minute mash to encourage full conversion and all of that stuff. I went for half an hour, and then I removed the grains from, it was a full volume mash, so I wasn't doing any sort of sparge or anything like that. Removed the grains, brought that wort up to a boil, and then boiled it for just 30 minutes. For the hops, I went with 35 grams of Perlay at 20 minutes and 30 grams of Hallertauer Mittelfrüh at 10 minutes. Why did I choose those? I think they were the first things my hands hit when I opened my hop freezer, and I was just, whatever, Perlay's got a decent amount of alpha acid that'll give me the bitterness, but we're not looking for big hop character. So what do you think of that choice?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I don't think it really makes a lot of difference. I think your Hallertau Mittelfrüh at 10 minutes for flavor probably didn't contribute an awful lot to the finished beer, I would imagine. I think they would get pretty lost. But yeah, that seems fine. But yeah, this is short and shoddy. So you've only mashed for 30 minutes. You've only boiled for 30 minutes. Which is going to make me wonder how well, especially such old grains, ended up turning out. Now, I'm looking here at the recipe, and the estimated original gravity for this beer is 1087. So you would expect to get something like an 8% beer. That's right in line with the BJCP guidelines. But you only did that 30-minute mash, and it was with super old grains. So did that come back to haunt you?
I do think that all of that together, or maybe just one aspect of it, and I will never know for sure what it was, did negatively impact overall efficiency. For this wort was only 1050 OG, which, you know, in the grand scheme of things is perfectly fine. It's not quite where the BJCP says a wee heavy should be, but 1050 is respectable. You know, you're going to get a good beer out of that. 41% brewhouse efficiency. That is about as bad as I've ever gotten. And I think a couple of things to look at here is, one, yes, the grains were old. Maybe that contributed to it. I've heard from many people, though, who said, no, I've used old milled grains and I got the same efficiency that I always got. The one big factor here that was different from my regular brewing, the beers that I make, is that I didn't mill the grains. And I know every time I would have my grains milled by another, basically a homebrew shop, whether it was More Beer or Ben Como's here locally, my efficiency would take like a 10% hit. Because when I mill at home, I have those rollers as close as they'll go, you know, and still pull the malt through, because I do brew in a bag. I like to have a really fine grist. In this case, that was not what this malt looked like. You know, it looked just cracked. So I think that was probably the biggest contributor to that lower efficiency. You've probably experienced this as well, though, with getting stuff milled elsewhere.
Yeah, this is exactly in line with what I've seen as well, is that the absolute biggest factor for brewhouse efficiency is how coarse the grain is milled. And I found exactly the same thing. Once I got my own grain mill, I would really, really put those rollers as close as I could as well, because it's going in the basket, it's fine, you know, and I would notice that if I just took the homebrew shop mill and I just took whatever the crush was from that, I would get an efficiency of around sort of like 62% for a sort of a medium strength beer. And if I took it and then ran those same grains through my roller at home, so I'm basically doing a second milling, I would see efficiency around 68 to 70%, and it's very, very consistent. So I'm sure that would be the biggest contributing factor here as well.
Yeah, that's what I think it is. Either way, I was happy to at least make 1050 OG. Anything lower, I'm like, all right, why are we even calling this a wee heavy? And I'll be honest, the only reason, when it comes to these short and shoddy batches, I had to tell myself, even if it falls way out of the guidelines, we're going to call it what the intention was and not what it turned out to be. We can discuss that in the article. So this was certainly the case with this beer here. I chilled that wort as quickly as possible. I think I got it down to 71 or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And then that, you know, it's short and shoddy. So I immediately pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast A31 tartan. Again, this was fresh. And just as an aside, this was almost 7 years ago, and man, how much love do we have for Imperial Yeast? These guys have been supporting us and sponsoring us by providing yeast for over 8 years now. I just think it's so awesome of them to do that. But yeah, Imperial Yeast A31 tartan is what I used for this one. I put the connected what we call a balloon lock to the fermenter. All it is a balloon on a little piece of tubing in a stopper to catch the CO2 that's created naturally from fermentation. And then once it's full, when you're racking the beer out of the fermenter into the keg, it'll suck the CO2 out of the balloon as opposed to oxygen from the air. It was just a little thing I used to try to avoid oxygen exposure. But total brew day time, about an hour and 30 minutes. That's not counting the prep that I did for about 15 minutes the day before. It's not including cleanup or anything like that. But God, an hour and a half for this beer. I did nothing that day. It was pretty simple.
Yeah, that's really pretty incredible that you could be just doing a mash for an hour and 30 minutes, and you still have another hour and 30 minutes for a boil in front of you as well. So the fact that you're able to get that all done so quickly is great. I'm looking at the pictures of this crazy balloon lock setup that you have here. It seemed I've heard you talk about it many times, and it seems like it would do the job. I think for this beer style, I would not be too concerned about oxygen exposure into the beer. I mean, we don't want to go crazy or anything, but because there is so little in the way of hops and it is so malty, I probably wouldn't be too worried. But, I guess it wasn't much work to put it on because you still got all that done in your 1 hour and 30 minute brew day.
Yeah. People will often talk about, bigger beers. They can benefit from not what we refer to as oxidation, but a little bit of age during which there's going to be some oxidization that happens. In this case, as a matter of course, I just try to avoid it altogether. And plus, I just think it's fun to take pictures of a fermenter with a heart-shaped pink balloon on it. So that's what I did here. After about 10 days of fermentation, it was active right off the bat. So things went well with the mash and boil. But after about 10 days, there was no signs of fermentation visible. So I took a hydrometer measurement showing that the beer had finished at 1014 FG, respectable, still a little bit lower than what we'd expect, but with a 1050 OG, it's all good. That resulted in a beer with a 4.7% alcohol content. To be honest, that's way lower than you'd expect for a wee heavy, but right in my wheelhouse. I kind of like those session table beers, so I wasn't complaining. At this point, I cold crashed the beer to 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.5 degrees Celsius overnight, added gelatin fining, and then I waited another 24 hours before transferring the beer to a serving keg. That filled keg was placed on gas in my keezer and burst carbonated at 45 psi for 15 hours before I reduced the gas to serving pressure. And just for those who are contemplating trying burst carbonation, you have to purge your keg as well. Otherwise, it's going to back pressure your secondary regulator and all that stuff. So make sure you purge the keg. But it was at serving pressure, and then I let it sit for another week just to kind of condition and stabilize that carbonation before it was ready for evaluation. Now, here's the deal. We're going to talk about the way this beer looked and what people thought, but this was the very beginning of the Short and Shoddy series. And for those of you who've been around for a while, you'll remember that we used to not tell people the style of beer and then give them the description. We used to actually try to have them just out of nowhere guess what the style is. So that's what we did here. The survey is just a little bit different than what we use today, so keep that in mind. Now, looking at a picture of this beer, do you see what I mean, Martin, by it was darker than you might have expected based on the grist, right?
Yeah, I'm looking at a picture now. Beautiful sunny day, holding it up to the blue sky. And yeah, it's definitely a lot darker than the recipe would have you believe. That is a lot darker than 16 SRM just by sight. But, if you look at what you've got here, clearly this does fall a little bit outside of the wee heavy guidelines in terms of original gravity and final gravity. But you've ended up with a beer that is nearly 5%. So it's not too far off in terms of strength. And if you put this in the old shilling system, we're at the export level here, which is the second highest level. So I think this is still a pretty close approximation of what a wee heavy would look like. And I don't know what the actual color of this is, but I would say that that's how I'd expect a wee heavy to look. It looks like a fantastic beer to drink.
Yeah, it's sort of like a dark brown with ruby highlights, which if you read the BJCP description, that's sort of what it's supposed to look like. So absolutely crystal clear. I mean, this was like commercial bright. Thank you, gelatin, by the way, with a tan Kappa foam that just stuck around the entire time. Really a gorgeous looking beer, in my opinion. What did I think of this beer? Before we get into the blind taster results, I thought it was pretty good. I didn't design the recipe. Scotty B designed the recipe and gave the grains to me, so I didn't have much, influence on the ultimate flavor of this beer. But, the lower ABV made it taste much more, to me, like a strong bitter than a wee heavy, but it was definitely more caramelly and toffee-like than you'd get from a typical English style. Had some toastiness. There was sweetness there. I mean, you expect that in this style, but it wasn't cloying. It was more like a delightful caramel, and I liked it. It was fairly dry, but not super dry, really easy to drink, which I think is just due to that lower ABV. And I didn't get any off flavors at all. It had kind of an earthiness to it that, again, I would expect, but really just a nice rounded example of a Scottish ale that without all of the alcohol that you'd expect from a wee heavy. So I liked it. This was definitely not a keg that I was going to dump. Now, we ended up serving this beer to 20 tasters, and I'm just going to go over the styles that people randomly guessed, when we asked them, oh, what style of beer do you think this is? What a dumb question. I don't even know why I thought of that at the beginning, but so here we go. You had 4 people who thought it was an international amber lager, which I think is hilarious. It tasted nothing like an international amber lager to me. 3 people thought it was an ordinary bitter. That makes sense. 2 people each thought it was a Vienna lager or a British brown ale. I could see British brown ale. Vienna lager again, no way. And then here we go. Each of the next beer styles got endorsed by one person. Czech Amber Lager, Hellesbock, Alt Beer, Amber Keller Beer, Strong Bitter, Irish Red Ale, Kentucky Common, Autumn Seasonal Beer, and yes, one person did think it was a wee heavy. So we'll call that a win, I guess.
Yeah, if you've not ever done this, where someone's given you a beer and then they've asked you, hey, guess the style, it is crushingly hard to do this. And yes, so these days when we do short and shoddy evaluations, we do tell participants what style they're drinking ahead of time. But for the other beers where we collect data, such as the experiment beers, we don't tell them anything about the beer style. And I'll often ask participants after they've completed the surveys to take a guess. Hey, what do you think you were drinking? And you get answers all over the shop. So yeah, the fact you've gone from a British brown ale through to a lager is pretty crazy here. You've really hit every kind of style. So
yeah.
but congratulations to that one person who nailed it. 1 out of 20.
I should go back and look to see what friend of mine actually got it right. Give him some kudos. But so in terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters rated the strongest characteristic as being its maltiness, which makes perfect sense to me, and I would totally agree with it. Yielded an average rating of 3.5 out of 5. Tasters then rated the dryness as a 2.7 out of 5, and the hoppiness came in the lowest at 1.3 out of 5. That all lines right up with my expectations. How about you?
Yeah, that's right. So dryness makes sense because we did get down to 10-14 on the final gravity. So you may expect not so many people to say dry if this were a little fuller beer. But yeah, malty clearly has topped the charts. And yeah, for anyone who's picking out any kind of hop character, good luck to them. I don't know how they did that.
Yeah, well, speaking of, that's what we're going to get to next. Now, we force people to pick, what is the most prominent hop characteristic you're picking up, and then we do the same thing for malt and yeast, and we give common descriptors for each of those. So in this case, and again, this lines up right with what I would think. 12 out of the 20 tasters felt that earthy hop character was the most prominent. Another 6 said spicy. 1 each noted melon and berry. And then nobody said fruity, pine resinous, floral, dank caddy, or onion garlic. That is exactly what my mind would go to. I would have said earthy if I took this survey myself, but I'm not sure that earthiness was really from the hops. I think when you're forced to pick one, you're kind of like, well, the beer has this earthy character to it. I'm just going to roll with that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I guess I don't know how you collected this data, if there were other beers consumed at the same time, but somebody clearly had quite a few if they were picking melon out of this.
No, I always do data collection before, getting lit with my friends. So, all right, for the malt character, 6 people each noted caramel sweet and nutty. So that's kind of nice. Another 3 said toasty. 3 more said roast. 2 said cracker bread crust, and nobody endorsed chocolate. I would easily have gone with caramel sweet, even though this thing finished at 10-14. That malt character was very, in my opinion, toffee-like, which to me says caramel. That's kind of an adjacent characteristic or flavor. But it also had a nice blend of nutty and toasty. So again, this lines up with what I'd expect.
Yeah, and if you told me nothing else about this beer, but you just showed me this malt characteristics chart, I would be ordering 3 pints of it because this is right in my wheelhouse. Fantastic. Yeah. Caramel sweet, nutty, a little bit toasty, a little bit of cracker bread crust. That sounds like a delicious beer.
Yeah, and so far so good, right? I mean, even though the OG or the ABV is super low relative to what the style says it should be or the guidelines say it should be, everything else is kind of lining up. So in terms of yeast character, 9 out of 20 people felt that, esters were the most prominent fermentation characteristic. Another 8 said it was clean fermentation. 2 noted phenolics, 1 noted sulfur, and nobody said wild. I would have gone with clean, to be honest, because I didn't pick up really a big ester character in this beer, but other people did, and that makes sense.
And you said that nobody detected any off flavors in the beer. The 2-year-old malt that had been sat in your garage at ridiculous temperatures, and there were no off flavors whatsoever detected. That's crazy.
And I'm telling you, I have got critical beer drinking friends who love to find off flavors in beer. And I was like, fully expecting them to come back and be like, oh, there's this, there's that. And mind you, not only were the grains 2+ years old and milled 2 years prior, I did a reduced, 30-minute mash. I did a 30-minute boil. I pitched at 72 degrees Fahrenheit. I did all the wrong stuff, and yet nobody noted any off flavors. I thought that was really interesting. One of the questions that we ask, that this is probably my favorite question on the Short and Shoddy survey, is how well does this beer align with what the BJCP provides as a description of the style, right? So how well does it represent the style? 1 out of the 20 people gave it a 5 out of 5. So that single person was like, this lines right up with the description that we provide them, right? Another 8 gave it a 4 out of 5. 9 gave it a 3 out of 5. One person said it was a 2 out of 5. One person said it was a 1 out of 5. Nobody gave it a 0 out of 5. But you look, you've got just 4 or 5 out of 5. 9 out of the 20 people, almost half the people, felt like it was a pretty solid representation of the style, despite being barely 5% ABV.
Yeah, well, I think we can write off the 1 out of 5 to being the melon guy, and we just ignore that one. But yeah,
melon guy,
the melon guy. But these are great scores. So yeah, 3 and 4 by far the most popular. The rating. This tells us that the beer style is certainly more than just in the wheelhouse, but this is a pretty good estimation of what people perceive to be a wee heavy. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, I mean, also kudos to Shoddy B for designing a wee heavy recipe that aligns with what you'd expect a wee heavy to taste like. Another question we ask, probably my least favorite question on the survey because of how subjective preference is. We just ask people how much they like the beer. So 2 out of the 20 tasters gave it a 5 out of 5. Another 11 gave it a 4 out of 5. So this was a beer that a majority of tasters actually enjoyed drinking. 7 of the tasters gave it a 3 out of 5, and nobody rated it lower than a 3 when asked if they prefer drinking it, if they enjoy drinking this beer. I say that's a pretty good, track record there. People actually liked the way this beer turned out.
Yeah, I have to be honest. If I'd been in the same situation and I'd found in my garage this bag of milled grain from 2 years ago, I wouldn't have even bothered brewing it. It would have found its way into the trash. And what a mistake that would have been just based on this here, because almost universally this beer was either enjoyed or really quite loved.
Well, that's basically what Shoddy B did, right? I was his trash can. He's like, hey, look, I'm going to toss these. I figured you could put them to use. And I'm glad he did, because we got this really cool Short and Shoddy beer out of it. Now, overall, I felt like, this beer had all of the aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel characteristics you would expect from a wee heavy. It was just a bit too weak. If it had 3% more ABV, just a more pungency in terms of alcohol, I think it would have been right there with some of the better wee heavies that I've had in my day. It was really a delicious beer. Again, just a little bit weaker. So we could call this one, because we're going with wee heavy, we'll call it a session wee heavy. So we do have some reader comments. The first one comes from Del Moses, who says, I really liked this article and experienced something similar, although not as drastic. I brewed an extract kit that was easily 6 to 8 months old. Since most of the fermentables were coming from the extract, I reasoned that the grains were contributing such a small percentage of overall sugars, so I just went with it. Samples during fermentation suggested the beer was in good shape. What say you, Martin?
Yep. I mean, it seems to be the case. We mentioned that after putting this out of the fermenter, things to kind of look for to see what sort of flavors we're getting in here, and look for any off flavors at that point before you presented these beers to servers. And I'm curious, when you actually racked this beer into kegs, did you try the sample before carbonation and so forth, just to see if this was even worth continuing with?
I do every single time, and even if I didn't like the beer or I don't like it, I'm gonna serve it to my friends. That's the kind of friend I am. But I tasted it, and I don't necessarily think that samples out of the fermenter are a good reflection of how it's going to taste carbonated and conditioned. But I don't remember not liking it. I thought it was kind of aligned flavor wise with what I would expect at that point. So yeah,
I do the same. It's never quite as good when it's not carbonated and it's not quite at the right temperature, but it is a good opportunity to see if there is going to be any kind of notable off flavors. You probably pick them up at that point. So I'm sure it was a relief to have tried that and be like, you know what, this is actually, this is going to work out.
Yeah. and Del Moses, I guarantee there's far more people out there, than just me or Del Moses who have used old grains with success. I doubt they talk about it publicly too much because, they don't want to get beat up, but yeah, I don't think it's all too uncommon. We'll put it that way. Final comment comes from Peter Milano, who says, about a year ago, which would mean it's like 7 years ago now, I guess, I asked a very small local brewery if I could add a couple bags of grain to their order and pay them for it in order to take advantage of the huge cost advantage. Being very small, they have all their grain pre-milled. That's odd, as they do not have a mill of their own. I didn't realize this and thus was stuck with 2 55-pound sacks of pre-milled two-row malt. I ended up taking a hiatus from brewing for several months, and when I got back to using it, it was nearly 2 years old. My typical efficiency was in the mid-70s when milling my own grain, but with this pre-milled grain, it was around 66 to 68%, which I attribute to the crush of the grain, as I got the same efficiency when on the first few batches I brewed where I used the grain a couple of years before. So what he's saying here is that he got the same efficiency when he used the grain fresh as when he did used it 2 years after the fact. So he says this indicates to me that the age of the milled grain was not likely a factor in the decreased efficiency, but more so the crush. Honestly, Peter, I'm with you. I actually think that was the biggest factor in with my low efficiency as well. I don't think the age had much to do with it, but maybe it did. Who knows?
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. 55 pounds of pre-milled two-row malt. But yeah, and now we know, at least from this one data point, that that's not something to worry about. Now I did notice one other reader comment, which was very important, and we didn't mention as part of the brew day, which was what you were listening to while brewing. And you did reveal that you were listening to 70s yacht rock. So were you listening to a bit of Rod Stewart or something to get you in the mood?
Look, I like Rod Stewart, but I think on that occasion it was probably some Lionel Richie, some Christopher Cross, little Kenny Loggins. That was at the time when I'd be brewing. It was constantly just yacht rock. One, it's nostalgic. Two, it's just really good music. So yes, that is what I was listening to.
That's important that you get the right music on. The malt can hear you, so you got to get this right.
Well, that about covers everything that we've got for Wee Heavy. Is there anything else before we wrap up, Martin, that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Look, this is a really nice, malty, rich style, and this is the time to brew one. Now the weather is, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, starting to get a little bit cooler, and if you allow a bit of time for this to condition as well, start brewing your Wee Heavy now, and then this is something you could really enjoy in late fall. It's just perfect time of year for that beer.
Absolutely. And just another side note, if you're not into the aging thing, I really do believe that the biggest change that occurs with time is stuff falling out of solution, we'll say. And so you can kind of hasten that process by using a fining agent like gelatin. So if you want to turn it around a little bit quicker, this beer that we drank, for this short and shoddy was a week old, in the keg, and it was great. People seem to enjoy it. So, well, remember to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Kate Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts, so you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy Wee Heavy.
The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
It's better over here. After investing billions to light up our network, T-Mobile is America's largest 5G network. Plus, right now, you can switch, keep your phone, and we'll pay it off up to $800. See how you can save on every plan versus Verizon and AT&T at T-Mobile.com/across America.
Up to 4 lines via virtual prepaid card. Allow 15 days. Qualifying unlocked device credit service ported 90+ states with device and eligible carrier and timely redemption required. Card has no cash access and expires in 6 months.